All right. So I don't know about James. He may pop on because he's got work, so he may pop on in just a little bit. And I don't know about Ted. We will see. All right. So let me ask you. You had asked about speaking in tongues and other languages and things like that, and that was from your class. That was from your group, right?
Yes.
So I'm largely unfamiliar with that particular spiritual gift. I don't have much experience with it, and I don't have a whole lot of resources for it. So, but if can you kind of, maybe I can help you if you'll sort of unpack a little bit of their questions about it, and then maybe I can help you.
Well, Judy Brewster was the one brought it up the most.
Mm-hmm.
Able to be there last week. I don't know that piece of questions. They were just, as I recall, they were more concerned about it being versus different languages, where when during the festival and when they're speaking in tongues, was it that much different than speaking in, say, the native language of each person?
Okay.
We were trying to see if that was the same thing, speaking in tongues, just because it sounded like babble to us, but it was really being understood by other people.
So my thinking around Pentecost is that the people who didn't understand what was being spoken were actually the disciples, because they were speaking languages they didn't know, but they were speaking not new and mysterious languages. They were speaking the languages of those who were there. So they were actual languages that were spoken in different parts of Asia Minor and around the Mediterranean. So yes, those were actual languages that they were speaking, and it was the disciples who didn't understand. When you read in I think it's 1 Corinthians 14, which is where Paul talks about, so it talks about spiritual gifts and starts in chapter 12. And
I went to something.
So chapter 12, starting in verse 10, towards the end, it says, he's listing off, well, it starts in 8. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, to another the utterance of knowledge, faith, gifts of healing, working of miracles, prophecy, discernment of spirits, and then it says to another various kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. These are activated by one and the same Spirit, who allots to each one individually just as the Spirit chooses. So that's 8. That's 1 Corinthians 12.
Where did you start? At 8?
Verse 8. So 8 through 11 there. So then he goes on to talk about the one body with many members, and can't all be an eye, all that jazz. Then there's chapter 13, which also speaks of, if I speak in the tongues of mortals and angels, but do not have love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. So again, continuing at that speaking language. But then 14 spends most of its time, chapter 14 spends most of its time talking about prophecy and tongues. And so he sets up this dichotomy between prophecy, which he defines as speaking to other people for their upbuilding and encouragement and consolation. That's verse 3. But speaking in tongues is speaking to God, for nobody understands them since they are speaking mysteries in the Spirit. So this is where it crosses over to speaking in tongues being, I sort of have my shorthand for it as your prayer language. So when you're speaking to God, then you are, at least in this particular way, if you're speaking in tongues, you're speaking directly to God. And so, when I think of speaking to God, I think of prayer. So that's kind of where I, put that in. Now, my prayer language is English.
Yes.
Just because.
Yeah. I wonder, how does that change?
Right. Now, but then there are our charismatic brothers and sisters in the faith who very much, either in corporate worship or in their own devotional life, in their own prayer life, have the ability to speak in tongues. And if I go back, if I put that together with what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12, where there's got to be, where there's the gifts of speaking in tongues, but there's also the gift of interpretation of tongues. That's where those two things have to come together so that the body of Christ is built up. Because if there's speaking in tongues, that's a new language, that it's, some sort of prayer language, but there's nobody there to go, okay, this is what they're saying, and then that, helps the congregation. Then, then it's not building up the congregation. It's not building up the church.
Now, is it a terrible thing to say? Because I think I shared with you that I went to a Pentecostal service with my 17-year-old daughter. And when they started doing that, I felt scared, but I felt guilty too, because I didn't believe it all. I just didn't believe when they're up there shouting these babbling words and people are just going ape for it. And I'm like, serious?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, is that bad of me? Is that what people really, is that why we are Methodist and not? I mean, that's one of the fine print ones, but
yeah,
it's just like, that's not real. I can't believe that these children, these teenagers, these members of the church are hearing the same thing that we are.
mm-hmm. Right. So I think it's okay to, call that into question. I mean, if it doesn't settle well with your own spirit and your own experience, then yeah, I mean, you can push back on that. I don't have a problem with that. And I would too. I would imagine if that's not what I grew up with, that's not how I was, and obviously it wasn't, then I'm gonna be a little skeptical about all of that. It's, I'm not saying that it's inauthentic. I'm just like, I just don't understand it. I don't personally understand it. And that's not how that's not how I regularly experience either the presence of the Holy Spirit or my own prayer life. Doesn't function that way. But
well, I'll convey this and give her those
sure.
Bible verses.
Yeah.
But I think I'll tell her also, if you have specific questions, then shoot you a text
Mm-hmm.
or an email so
Right.
that you know exactly what she's looking for. I kind of felt like after I explained that there was still this question mark on her face,
Right.
but
Right. And
that
you
might,
can, yeah, I talked about how I combined chapter 14 and chapter 12 to make sure there's an interpreter. At the end of chapter 14, it's talking about orderly worship. It says, when you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up. If anyone speaks in a tongue, this is verse 27, let there be only two or at the most three, and each in turn, and let one interpret. But if there is no one to interpret, let them be silent in church and speak to themselves and to God. So that's, I mean,
keep the
it's not,
silence.
yeah, it's not helpful if there's just a bunch of people, babbling in the pews, or even from the pulpit, or from the altar area. It's not helpful. Obviously, there wouldn't have been a pulpit or anything like that.
Right.
But it would have been. It's hey James.
Hey.
It's not helpful if there's not somebody to be able to interpret what's actually going on. So that's why I always pull back to.
Okay. Well, I'll give her those verses,
Sure.
and then tell her to get to you.
Yep.
More questions.
Very good. Sounds
Okay,
good.
thank you.
All right. So now we can. Now that James is here, we can move on to.
Well, I decided to not treat everyone to me stuffing my face.
Why, thank you.
You're so kind, sir. You're a gentleman and a scholar. All right. So this week we looked at several. We see another sort of summary statement of how the early church is behaving amongst one another, and 4:32 to 37, and how they hold things in common, distributing to each as they had need. And then we see immediately following after that how some people missed the message on that. Ananias and Sapphira. And Gary had a question about that, and I'll share that with y'all. He emailed me that, so I'll share my response to that. And then we see there's more signs and wonders, and even Peter's shadow can heal people now. That was kind of interesting, by the way. And then the Peter and John get arrested, and then they're in front of the council again after the angel lets them out, and they go back and they get back in front of the council. So, and actually, my sermon this weekend is actually Saturday's reading and Monday's reading. So.
You didn't want to do people dropping dead?
Could have, but my wife and I struggled through that for 3 days this week to try to figure out what all was going on there, and I've finally come to some peace about that. But considering I preached my sermon for this coming Sunday 3 weeks ago, that wasn't going to be helpful. So anyway, so what questions do y'all have about this week's readings other than people dropping dead, which I'm happy to talk about?
Yeah. I used N.T. Wright a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I like the emphasis on the word ordinary again. I think we had gone through this a couple of weeks ago about ordinary, or maybe last week, I don't know. And that's something that should give hope to those of us living in this modern age. That it's not just people during that time, and it's not people who are of high esteem um, around the world or in that area. It's ordinary people. God's power is shown through the ordinary, so we can understand that it is God's power.
We talked quite a bit about that last class about being bold in our faith, and that book learning is good, well and good, but being there, Jesus, for instance, I mean, you can't beat the in-person knowledge.
Right.
I thought about my brother-in-law learned to speak Spanish. Okay, and yeah, he took a couple of years there at UT, but he spent a better part of a year in Cuernavaca, and there you're forced to learn. You're forced to learn all the intricacies of that language. So being there, immersed in it, is what's really, really important.
Mhm. So I'll pull up Gary's question that he asked. It was about, let's see, where to go, There it is.
And did I read it wrong, or was this in my in bed dreams or something? If they had been honest up front and said, okay, we don't want to give all of our profit from our land. We'd like to keep this much, for a rainy day fund or whatever they made up.
Mhm.
Would the outcome have been different? Because then they didn't lie.
Right, you are correct. Yes. So that was one of my comments back to Gary, because he asked about if I was. He says, he asked, I hope you're going to address the importance of giving tithing that is discussed in much of this week's readings. If not, what is your understanding of the donation scenarios presented this week? So, so I talked about, I addressed that in like 4 different parts. So, I talked about how Acts 4:32-37 presents the early church sharing everything because they were of one heart and soul. And it's my understanding that they're doing this out of the fact that they are in the process of forming a new quote unquote family, where each member contributes to the whole so that all of the members of the family can benefit, not just the rich ones. And I'm going to be coming back to this actually for the weekend of the 11th, when talking about the widows getting slighted in the food distribution lines in chapter 6. But then Acts 5:1-11, which is Ananias and Sapphira, I told him, I said that it shows what happens when followers of Christ do not take seriously the holiness of God. Ananias and Sapphira were, one, not forced to sell their property and give away the proceeds. They were not forced to give everything to the apostles for the work described in Acts 4:35. But what they did was they sold their property and they conspired together to hold back a portion and then lie about how much the property actually sold for as they were making their gift. So yes, Sandy, your assessment is correct that they were not, the description of the community at the end of chapter 4 is not it's not a requirement. It's not that everybody had to sell everything in order to make sure that there were proceeds for those who were poor. Because if you think about it, well, then where would they live, and where would they have met, those kinds of things as the movement continues, because there aren't like buildings like where I am now, where large gatherings of people could get together. They met in homes. They met, they met in the temple and the courts and all this kind of stuff. But they met in homes for meals, and they shared their fellowship there. So if everybody sold their homes, where would they meet? So when Ananias and Sapphira sell this piece of property, what the problem was is that they sold it, and under the guise of giving it all, they held back some. They said, okay, here, we're going to give 80%. They're going to, they're like, all right, we're going to hold on to 20% or whatever. And we're going to give 80%, but we're going to tell everybody we sold it for that 80% number. And that was the problem. So I went on to say, and I came to this this realization before I read NT Wright on this particular thing, because what he said is fairly close to what I discerned. I also said, as this new community was forming, they were in some sense becoming the new temple, and the Lord dwells in the temple. Therefore, holiness is required when dealing with temple issues. While we don't have many scenarios, this is what I'm telling Gary, while we don't have many scenarios where people were immediately punished for their sins without an opportunity for repentance, which is what happens to Ananias and Sapphira, we do have some precedent for this. So 2 Samuel 6, where Uzzah touches the Ark of the Covenant and is immediately struck down. Leviticus 10, where Nadab and Abihu offer unholy fire. Joshua 7, where Achan holds back treasure that should have gone to God. And then 2 Chronicles 26, where King Uzziah attempts to make an offering in the temple, which he was not allowed to do. And so Uzzah is the only one who dies right away. Nadab and Abihu die just a little bit later. Achan is killed by the community because of what he does, and then King Uzziah has leprosy for the rest of his life and dies.
Yeah, the thing with Uzzah, I mean, I always thought that was kind of harsh. I mean, it was about to,
It was wobbly.
Wobbly. He's trying to steady it, and dang.
I know, right? Yeah, but again, because the Ark of the Covenant was God's presence dwelling, and that's where, that's why it had to be on the poles, is because they couldn't touch it, and it had to be, carried in that manner, which is interesting because if it's being carried on those poles, into Jerusalem, what else was happening in that scene when he had to reach out and try to steady it? I mean, did it look like the lid was going to fall off? Did it look like, one of those other guys that were, one of the 4 guys who were, holding the poles, stumbling or something like that? I don't know.
I watched Raiders of the Lost Ark, and
Oh.
they didn't
do that
right away.
No, the face melt happened later.
Oh, mercy.
Oh, goodness. Yes. Face melt. Anyway, so my sort of closing statement to Gary was this. I said, overall, giving of any kind, financial, time, talents, etc., should be done wholeheartedly and to the glory of the Lord. This carries over to us today. Our offerings should be our best gifts, not our leftovers. Our skills should be used to enable all to give praise to God. When gifts are given to see what we can get out of them, then we have forgotten who provided those gifts and who deserves the glory for them. So,
would you copy us on that response?
Sure. Yeah, I'll forward that to you. Not a problem.
Like it.
My take on that has always been, our lives are not what they could be if we don't. They're a little less than what they could be. And that's not like getting, get your face melted, but
Hmm.
our lives are less than what they could be.
Well, and how many times have you heard people say, I'm being punished? I know that's why I fell and broke my leg, or
Mm.
I'm being punished for, and they tell you about something they did. And I just don't go along with that one.
Right. Yeah. Yep. So, but in the midst of that, hey Don,
Hi, how are y'all?
good. So at the end of Wednesday's reading, great fear seized the whole church and all who had heard these things. So this idea of that, I think they're beginning to see the seriousness with which God is present in this movement, and the seriousness with which the apostles are taking the responsibility. And so people are like, oh, okay. And then it translates over to Thursday's reading, where none of the rest dared to join them, even as they were out there. I'm just wondering if there's sort of this hangover of, oh, we just saw a couple of people drop dead. Maybe we should, hold back a little bit and see what else is going to happen. But even in that, people are still being brought into the faith. People are bringing out their sick in order to have Peter's shadow fall on them, and a great number of people, verse 16, gathered from the towns around Jerusalem, bringing the sick and tormented by unclean spirits, and they were all cured. So the Spirit is still at work in all of those places, and that whole scenario, even as there was, some wondering about what all was going on.
Do you think that we may soft sell membership in the church?
Say more about that.
I've been, I spent a lot of time in the E Free Church, and they had classes.
Right.
If you were going to join, you had to go to a class, and it was a semester-long class. Yeah, it was long. But it was, so hey, this is serious business, okay?
Mm-hmm.
In our church, it's stand up, and we say, I'll support you through our prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. What do you think about that?
So I'll answer your question. Yes and no, or it depends.
Okay.
It depends if all we ever ask of people who join the church is, will you support it with your prayers, presence, gift, service, and witness, and leave it at that. Then that's a soft sell. That's less than what we could do. If, as a church, we take the time to explain what prayers, presence, gift, service, and witness really mean and really entail, then that's going to translate into people understanding what they're actually signing up for, what they're actually agreeing to. So the answer is it depends, and it depends on how the church, each local church, because I know that there are Methodist churches in our denomination or in our conference who they may not have a semester-long class, but it's like 4 solid weeks of here's what it is, here's what it means to be a Methodist, here's what it means to be a Christian, here's what it means to be a member of this particular local church, and then here's what it means to serve in a larger community. And they, you have to, it's probably a total of 4 hours over the course of a month, but
Mhm.
It's still a hurdle to jump over to become part of the church. And all along the way, they're very clear that you can worship here as long as you want. You don't have to go to this class to be a Christian, kind of thing. But if you want to be part of, if you want to call this your church home and fully embrace those membership vows, then this is what you do. But for every one of the churches that do that, there's probably 6 or 8 that just go, hey, sure, come on front, and we'll transfer your membership from wherever, and and don't ask you any more questions and don't require anything of you. We set the bar like really, really low so that people will join. But what happens when you set the bar really, really low is you have really, really low engagement of people, because it's kind of like signing up for a newsletter, an email newsletter. I mean, it's like 2 clicks and a name, and and you're there. Rather than some kind of investment of time and resources. So
I was, when you were saying that, it depends. I recall there's a lady, and I mentioned her in one of the sermons that we did there, and she attended that church in shirts for probably 50 years. And she was, a regular giver, a tither, was involved in all kinds of things. She was wonderful, wonderful lady, helped the community all the time. She never was a member of that church. She never joined the church, but she went there for 50 years.
right. And for some people, at least in our current age, people my age and younger, membership is not quite as important as engagement. Like saying I'm a member of Wiley United Methodist Church is not as important as that's where I serve, and that's where I worship, and that's where I study, and that's that it's not as important as to check the box of I'm a member there. So I mean, there are so when you talk about like low bar kind of low hurdle sort of getting in kind of churches, and then high bar kind of churches, and they exist across the spectrum of theology and worship and all that kind of stuff. The churches that have a high bar or high expectation of members actually end up with a reverse of what we see in the Methodist Church, which is they have more people who attend than are actually members. And in the Methodist Church, I don't know any Methodist church. Well, there's probably a couple of Methodist churches that have that sort of scenario, but most Methodist churches have far more members than they do attenders, somewhere to the tune of, like there's a joke among clergy that if you have 40% of your membership in worship on a Sunday, you're doing good.
Yeah, the average is 33%. Well, at least it was a few years ago.
Yeah, that's about right. About a third. So if you have 200 people in worship, that means there's 600 people on your rolls. 600 people you pay apportionments on.
That E-Free Church, it probably had 200 or 300% of membership and attendance.
There you go.
Not people joined, but a lot of people attended.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if it's a semester long, yeah, and you're gonna have that flip.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Cool. All right. What other questions do you have?
I'm ready for it. up with. But
That's
This will be an interesting discussion this week.
hmm Yeah, this is a tough part of the Book of Acts. These readings this week.
next week's not going to be a piece of cake.
True.
That one,
I didn't get a chance to ask Debbie how Sunday went. Since I was, did she let you know how class went on Sunday?
Yeah, she said it was. So she said that it was. She said it was a smaller group, but they had really good conversation. She was able to share, more of her story. She worked all week long on her list of questions and what she was going to share, and then she said eventually she said the last few minutes I kind of went off script, and I'm like, that's fine. That's the Holy Spirit right there.
We
So,
do that. It's like I'm not going to try to squelch something like that. That's
Right.
all.
No, she was happy with how everything turned out. She was able to share her a story from our early portion of our relationship, and she said she was crying and other people were crying, so it's good. Anyway.
Awesome.
Yeah. I don't know if she's ready to do that again anytime soon, but
You know what? For the longest, she wouldn't say anything in there, and then she really came out of her shell, and I was surprised she said, "Yeah, I'll do it right off." I mean, that's great.
Yeah.
I'm impressed.
well, I cut mine down. That first one, I didn't want to scare everybody away. We went an hour and a half on our first Zoom meeting, and I was like, I even had one of my members go, "Sandy, how long is this class?" I said, "Well, Carol, it's as long as we take. We don't have a time constraint now."
Right.
Oh,
Yeah,
well,
when you go
I
from
need
that-
to go.
Yeah. When you go from that, I've only got 40 minutes
40
window
minutes.
to, I can do whatever we want.
Yep.
Yeah.
So now we're shooting right at an hour.
That's
what
good.
the last one.
We're famous for running over.
Yeah.
It's like it's when you have a Socratic class like that where you're asking questions and getting everybody's feedback. Two things are going to happen. You're going to run over, and you're probably going to get a little bit off topic every once in a while. But
How many do you have, James? How many are joining you?
it's only probably 8 to maybe 8 at the most.
Oh, okay.
And our class size is about 20, 25. So it's about a third of the class, which is, right. It's about 33%.
You're right at the Methodist denominational average.
No, I think once we get going again with Sunday school in the building and everything like that, that number will bump up.
Yeah.
People want to see each other. They like talking about their lives and hearing about everyone's lives. So
Mhm.
What's the word? What's the feel for people coming back? What do you?
I think folks are ready to roll. So let me see. I put the registration link up today. So let me see if let's see.
you did.
It's on the website. Oh, nobody's registered yet, but that's okay.
You probably need to put an email out saying, "Hey, registration's on the website."
Probably. So, anyway, but yeah, well, I think with our current numbers and their dispersion, I think the first service is going to fill up pretty quickly. Because we have about twice as many people worshiping online for the traditional service than we have space for in our socially distant worship center. So I anticipate that being mostly full at the 9 o'clock hour, and that there will be space. It may be about half full for the second service.
So for those of us who have no real preference, you would encourage us to go to the second one.
Yeah, unless, that would be my encouragement. I mean, the message is going to be the same, but it's
Music.
So it's up to you. So,
Okay.
I mean, I'm not going to tell you not to come to the early service if that's what you want to do. So, because again, not everybody that wants to, come is going to be able to, just because either they've got, conditions that prevent them from that, or their own hesitation. So,
I'm even, we're starting choir this Sunday.
Right.
Well, since we're leaving, we're gonna just, didn't you get the books in? Did Casey get the book? He was supposed to let us
I believe,
know.
yeah, I think there's a box on his chair in the office, so I would imagine that that's what it is.
He said we could come pick him up, and we're gonna keep the book anyway. So
Okay,
we are on practicing.
very good.
We're real hesitant. We're even afraid coming back, stopping at El Paso, seeing the family.
Mhm.
They're not as this thing is real. They don't believe in the mass. I don't know.
Hmm.
I sure want to see them, but I don't want to risk everything we've been doing for 7 months.
Right. Yeah, so it'll be good. It'll be, I think a lot of the folks who are coming to drive-in worship, or some of the folks will jump back in person, but we'll see. I mean, it's going to be, yeah, it's going to be a change no matter what. So,
We've got our grandson, Michael's little boy, Kingston, quarantined home. Little boy in his class at school. So, and of course, he went to their daycare also.
goodness. Yeah, well, we're going to make sure everything's clean and everybody stays where they need to be, and and we're going to still we're live streaming everything to the website, so you'll still be able to participate in worship even if you're at home. So,
Ushers be issued tasers and stuff like that.
cattle prods,
Somebody gets cattle prods. Okay.
little squirt bottles, like, no, if you're a cat, no.
Have you come up with how long or where we can access? For instance, while we're traveling, we're not going to be able to watch 9 o'clock live.
Right.
How we're going to access that?
Our hope is to have the worship service up by Monday afternoon, because we've got it'll be recording while it's being broadcast, and then we'll just have to, sort of trim off the ends and get it uploaded to the site. And that's just some processing power and some time to do that. So, hopefully by, I would love it if we could have it by lunch on Monday, but we'll see.
I think Gary said that there's a way to record the live feed But I'm not sure exactly how it's done.
I thought Ted was talking.
It was Ted. Okay.
about
Yeah, I mean,
Like
since
FaceTime
we're
it
not going to be
or-
going through Facebook, it'll go through, it's through a different platform. So it's, but it'll be original video that gets posted. So,
Okay.
and we have the ability to then take that video and then repost it on that particular site as well. So it may be like, hey, we can post it on Tuesday, and people can watch it again on Tuesday or Thursday or whatever. We can reuse that platform, but we'll also have it archived on the website. Man, I unloaded 1,000 pumpkins yesterday, and my back is killing me.
What time did they arrive? I was gonna. I was.
4:45.
Oh, okay. I was still at work. Okay.
Yeah. Yep, and we had them all off the truck just before 7. So
Oh, how many people did you have there?
about 50 ended up being there.
Really?
Good.
That's good.
Yep. But yeah, they're all out there now. Come on and buy some.
Yep.
All the early birds are here. We'll be here in the next few days to get all their pumpkins. So. Very good. All right. Well, I will be praying for your group meetings this week.
Thank you.
If you need anything between now and our next lunchtime get together, let me know. And let's see. You'll be at the next one.
Copy that email.
Yes, I will do that as soon as we're done here.
Okay.
And that way you'll have that. So, very good.
Alrighty.
Appreciate y'all. You'll have a great rest of your week.
Take
Bye.
care.
Bye.
Bye.